Dr. Ruth Westheimer passed away this past weekend at the time of this recording, and it had me reflecting on the impact she had on my life. And it had me reflecting further on just her life in general and all that she did and why. Now, if you're wondering what this has to do with healthcare for transgender non-binary patients, hang on and I'll get there. But allow me this minute of reflection first, because there is a connection. But when I think about like Dr. Ruth and I think about growing up, I don't remember exactly when I learned or when I knew, but I knew that my sister, at some point, I learned that my sister would listen to her late night talk show at night on our clock radios. For you that people that don't know what clock radios are, they were a big deal for the time in the 80s, where we not only had a radio, but it had a clock too, and an alarm and a sleep button, so you could have it play the radio and turn off on its own in an hour. All amazing things where these a clock and a radio used to be two separate things. So we often would listen to things at night as we went to sleep. And for my sister, who was older, she would listen to Dr. Ruth and learned a ton about herself, her body, her sexual health, all through that, where an education that she would not have gotten any other way, and often credits that talk show for her own good health. And I credit it for mine because at the time that she was listening, I was not at an age that I even cared. I wasn't interested in listening to talk radio. I wasn't curious or anything. But because of my sister's education and her being older, she passed it along to me and gave me a lot of understanding on intimacy and decision making. And so for that, I've always forever been grateful to my sister as well as to Dr. Ruth for sharing her knowledge, for sharing her education at a time where it really wasn't okay. And I think that's been the most recent reflection for me, is thinking about how it wasn't okay, how it wasn't okay to talk about sex, especially for anyone who identified as a woman. And if you identified as a woman, it wasn't okay to have desire or interest. We were taught, and I think it was pretty well understood, everyone was taught to wait until marriage. You didn't have sex before that, and you didn't make yourself seem available or interested. Like there were so many gender roles. And what Dr. Ruth Wood is very respectfully challenged all of it. She normalized sex between two consenting adults. And she did it in such a non-judgmental way that so many people felt the freedom to ask those questions they've always had, but didn't know where to find the answers, that they were scared to ask the question because they were concerned about feeling embarrassed or ashamed for even thinking the question or having the question or wanting to know the answer to the question. But Dr. Ruth provided a very safe space for that. And she endured criticism for what she did. She endured criticism for, being considered irresponsible for the education she was giving, that it was threatening to what people considered the moral character of society by normalizing sex. What was going to happen? What was going to happen if women, people who identified as women, considered it okay to have desire? And I think is way, way more than that. She taught about so many things, but she knew that the educational piece would help people with their relationships, not only with their relationship with others, but with their relationship with themselves. She knew it was a normal part of biology and it was a normal part of interaction and health. And so to me, that's where the consistency is. When I think about transgender health and medical healthcare providers understanding about gender, it's normal, it's biology, it is a part of our learning. And yet, there is such a misunderstanding in society about it that is easily overcome with education. And so, on one hand, I find that many healthcare providers are afraid of the criticism, whether they're afraid of the criticism of not knowing what they think they should know, that's in regards to gender. So they're afraid to ask for help. They're afraid to do the learning. They're afraid to admit that, hey, I don't know this. But there's also the fear of criticism that if they do know, if they do support gender affirming care, if they do speak up for it, that they will also receive criticism for that. And the problem with not doing something out of fear of criticism is it in either of those examples, it takes you away from your own values. Because a lot of times for that first example of people that are embarrassed to say, I don't know, and I feel like I should, and I'm worried I'm going to get criticized for not knowing, but I feel like I should, is that it doesn't matter what you should or shouldn't do. If it is your value to know that this is part of healthcare, and that's sometimes what I hear from physicians is, I know this is part of healthcare, but it's not something I learned. And it's probably true. Depending on when you went through not only when you went through your medical education, but where you went through your medical education, it's very likely that you didn't get any education on gender. So it makes sense. However, if you're afraid to say, hey, I need help on this because I didn't get educated on this, if you shy away that out of fear of criticism, you're moving away from your values because your values are telling you, I want to learn, but I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to learn out of fear of criticism. And just as if you do know and you desire to provide gender affirming care, but you're afraid of criticism of the outside world, then you too are moving away from your values. If your value is to provide that care for all patients, then that is what you need to do. And if you back away from it from criticism, you're moving away from who you are and your values. And that is something Dr. Ruth taught us. This was of value to her to educate people knowledgeably. And that is what she did based on her values. And so I encourage us to stick to our values as well. I think the other thing that comes up is that along those same lines of fear of criticism is I read something recently that medical schools that have considered teaching or have taught about gender have moved away from it out of fear of losing funding from their politicians depending on the geographical location of their institution. And this has been a reality for some hospitals, from some healthcare providers. If they provide gender affirming care, they have lost funders. And at the end of the day, yes, there are a lot of factors. Money is, if I can't provide care if you don't have the funding. However, at the same time, to go against what your values are does not feel good. It does not have you showing up. And also to think, I either have these funders or I stick true to my values and I have no funders, you forget a whole bunch of other options that are in between. There are other funders, there are other ways to do it. But the bottom line is, I think as healthcare providers in general, we are very value based. We go into this work because of our values, and it does not feel good to go against them. It does not feel good to show up to be part of an institution that goes against those values. Again, something Dr. Ruth demonstrated in her own life. The other thing is we have a role to play as healthcare providers. When we have the education, we can provide the education. There has been research to show that when people learn that a physician is explaining it as a biological process, there's more acceptance of the information. Now, I think we're all going to come up with thoughts on social media because that's not true. Yes, healthcare gets questioned and healthcare gets that, but in general, there's no all or nothing. There is some truth to it, and rightfully so. Like, gender is a part of biology. It is a part of who we are, and it is something that we can speak to. We understand as healthcare providers the true diversity, the biodiversity that exists in humans. I mean, just there is no binary in science. There is no binary in humans. There is nothing that we can say, well, everybody is either born this way or that way. Nothing. Everything has an exception. No matter how rare it is, there is always an exception. And I think that's something we understand. I think we understand as healthcare providers how life, science, biology is not black and white. All the time, you cannot get through a medical education without learning and seeing the rarest, strangest things happen from time to time. And so I feel like we can play a role by using our voices, by educating, just the way Dr. Ruth did. She didn't get political. She considered herself a very non-political person, even though some of the things she talked about were political. But from her, and rightfully so, they were just education. They were facts. And she shared her facts, and she shared her knowledge, and she shared her education. She wasn't there for a debate on feelings and emotions. She was there to share knowledge. And we can do the same thing. So here are ways in which I think we can use our voices and educate when it comes to gender in that same spirit of Dr. Ruth. The first one is be knowledgeable. Understand gender. Like I said, you probably, I would venture to say most people listening, went through a medical education without being taught. So take the time to learn. The learning is not a lot. I think what takes the time is that learning about gender, the difference between gender identity and gender expression and biological sex, that challenges what most of us learned growing up. And those beliefs we had about gender are challenged. And that to me is what takes time, not the information. The information doesn't take much time. The facts don't take much time. But we have to be willing to look at how that challenges our beliefs. And that is worth the time to be able to show up in an informed way, to be able to treat all patients and understand gender. So the first thing you can do is be knowledgeable. The second thing you can do is use inclusive language. Learn and pay attention. Start out with that awareness of where am I not being inclusive? Because a lot of times when we're not being inclusive, we are making assumptions on who we're talking to. We're making an assumption who a person is, who the people are that they relate to. And so by using inclusive language, we let go of assumptions and we teach other people that I cannot know who somebody is by looking at them. I cannot know someone's gender identity because I know their biological sex. I cannot know. So we educate by using our own inclusive language. It becomes language people hear, and then it's planting that seed of ways to talk. Now, people think using inclusive language is some wild different language. It's not. It's everyday language. It's just becoming aware of when we don't use it and substituting in that everyday language right in there. But in doing that, we set the example that we wish to see in the world. The third thing that you can do is share your pronouns. If this is something you feel comfortable with, and I don't believe pronouns should ever be mandatory, but if it's something you feel comfortable with, then introducing yourself with your own pronouns is a way of saying, hey, I know you can't look at somebody, their gender expression, and know how they identify, so I'm going to share with you my pronouns. If you want to share yours, you can. If not, that's fine too. And you can ask, you cannot ask, but just sharing your own pronouns, whether in your name tag, whether when you verbally introduce yourself, it is educating the world. Some people are like, well, why are you doing that? It says, because I know, and I'm sharing with you the knowledge that I cannot know how somebody identifies by looking at them. It's the difference between gender expression and gender identity. Now, if you feel like, Shannon, I got those three things, I'm good with that, I'm going to give you 3 ideas that are going to stretch you. And you may not be ready for this. Follow your values. But I'm going to tell you why I think these are the next steps when the time is right. The first thing is to look at your policies. What policies do you have about gender? Meaning, are there things for women? Are there things for men? looking at those policies and seeing how you can change them, how you can change the language of them. What do they mean? Because I find that a lot of times we use terms like men and women to be this like generic terminology to actually indicate something else. It's an easy way of what we actually mean, whether we mean referring to people's anatomy, whether we're referring to certain attitudes, to certain personalities, certain bodies, whatever it is. There is a lot of kind of generic assumption in there, and that's the problem. When we make assumptions, we don't include everyone and we exclude people. So looking at those policies and see, when we use gendered language, why are we using it? Is it serving the goal of the purpose of that policy? Okay, you might think that's not totally crazy, but hold on to your hats, because this one I have spoken to about to healthcare providers and ultrasonographers, and I get a little pushback. But I think, as someone who used to do level 2 ultrasounds, so those are prenatal ultrasounds looking at the fetus in a belly, many times we're asked, is it a boy or is it a girl? I don't think we should answer that question, because if we understand gender identity, then we know we can't say that, because we can't look at the ultrasound and know how somebody is going to identify. Great educational piece. And I'm saying this as somebody that remembers a person punching a hole in the wall when they did not like what the anatomy observed and what the assumption was and what that baby was going to be assigned at birth. But this is what I encourage. Say what you see. Just like any other part of the heart. If we say, I see a 4-chamber heart with a normal left ventricle outflow tract and a normal right ventricle outflow tract, if you're like a normal aortic arch, if you're like, what are you talking about? These are the things, the structural features of the heart that we look at. But I can't tell you how it's going to pump when the baby is born. I can't tell you what kind of rhythm that heart is going to have when the baby is born. Can't make those assumptions based on a structurally normal. Probably will be okay, but we don't know that for sure. To me, this is the same thing. If we understand the difference between biological sex and gender identity, then we don't say it's a boy or it's a girl. We say, I see a fill in the blank of whatever anatomy you see. To me, that will be part of educating society and leading the cause, because we don't know if it's going to be a boy or girl. We only know the anatomy that we see. And then the last one I have. This one is going to push the financial button a little bit. But I see so much women's health, men's health, women's center, this center. Again, I think it's a generic term for what you're actually after. Are you after people with certain anatomy? Are you after people with certain physiology? I'll give you an example. Not all women who identify as women have babies. And sometimes that's what we're talking about. I think we can use terms to mean what we mean. You know, if we say gynecologic, some people, the argument will be, well, not everyone will understand that. Then you educate. People did not always know what maternity was, or, maternal health, and there's educated. I mean, I think there are other examples like oncology. Not everyone knows what oncology is, but we educate. And so I think when we use terms like women's health, again, it demonstrates that if that's not what we're after, if we're after people with certain anatomy is sex, women is an identity. And so when we use that term, it does not demonstrate that we understand the difference between identity and sex. And so for me, the bold step in really being the example and following your values is stop using terms of gender when you mean something specific about anatomy or physiology, or functioning, anything like that. Now, I said it touches a money value, and that's because women's health is is often used because financially, a lot of times in a family structure that has a female adult in it, someone who identifies as a woman, they are the ones that are making the healthcare decisions for the family in general, not always, but many institutions like having women's health as trying to appeal to the main decision maker of a family. Again, in general, there are no always and nevers. I think we can do it in other ways. I really do believe that. But those are the bold steps. People often ask me, those are my bold steps. You may not be ready for it, but I hope you at least think about it. Think about who you're excluding. Think about how you're demonstrating a lack of knowledge between identity, expression, or identity and sex, depending on what we're talking about. And who do you want to be? Because that's what I learned from Dr. Ruth. Using my knowledge as power, knowing who I wanted to be, and sticking to it. Have a great week and continue to engender love.